Good evening. My name is Patricia O'Reilly, and on behalf of the Jesuits of Canada and Jose Sanchez, our communications director, I want to welcome you here this evening to hear our talk with Father James Martin. Father's here to talk about prayer and his book, Learning to Pray. And after his talk, we will give him the questions that you submit on our Q&A throughout the evening. Tonight's talk will be recorded, and it'll be posted on the Jesuits of Canada website, so you don't have to take notes. You can listen to it again. And I'm going to turn it over to Jose, who's going to tell you how you can listen to which language you prefer. Jose?
So I will switch to French for this. Alors, pour choisir la langue de votre préférence, si vous êtes sur un ordinateur, dans les commandes de votre réunion ou webinaire, cliquez sur le bouton Interprétation et après, cliquez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. Si vous êtes sur un appareil mobile, dans le contrôle de votre réunion, appuyez sur le bouton avec les trois petits points au plus et après, appuyez sur l'interprétation de la langue. Et finalement, appuyez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. C'est important de se souvenir que l'interprétation linguistique n'est pas disponible lorsque vous accédez à Zoom sur un navigateur web. And three other reminders. You can ask questions through the question and answer button, also at the bottom or top of the screen, depending on the device that you're in. Like Patricia said, questions will be answered towards the end of the session. A recording, as Patricia said, will be shared by 24 hours after the event. And if you have technical problems, feel free to reach out to me through the chat box. It's also a button. If it's not already there on the right side of the screen, you can click on the chat box and I will assist you. Thank you, Patricia. Over to you.
Thank you. We'll start our evening with a land acknowledgement, which because of the times in Canada at the moment with the sorrow of our Indigenous people, it is particularly poignant that we begin. We wish to acknowledge the land on which the Jesuit Sacred Heart House operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. It's my pleasure to welcome back to Canada virtually Father James Martin, who is a member of the Society of Jesus. He is editor-at-large of America Magazine and a consultant to the Vatican Secretariat for Communication. He is the author of numerous books, including the New York Times bestseller, Jesus, a Pilgrimage, The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, and My Life with the Saints, which Publishers Weekly named one of the best books of the year. Father Martin is a frequent commentator in the national and international media. He has been interviewed by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he has appeared on all the major news networks and in other diverse outlets such as the Colbert Report. Father Martin will be talking to us tonight about his book, Learning to Pray, A Guide for Everyone, and he's going to talk to us about how and why to pray. Father, thank you for being with us here this evening, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Jose, and thank you to the Jesuits of Canada for inviting me. I'll start with a land acknowledgement as well. I'm here in New York City, which is the traditional land of the Lenni Lenape people who occupied this land for many years. I am very happy to be with you. I also want to thank our translators before we start. I'm going to speak a little more slowly than I normally do because of the translation. I want to also say to all the French-speaking people who are listening que je suis désolé well, hold on. Sorry, I turned my phone off. I thought I just did that. Pardon me. Let me just make sure my phone's off completely, which I thought I just did. So, que je suis désolé que je ne peux parler français meilleur. Ma mère était un professeur de français, and I spent many years studying French, but not as good as I would want to, and certainly not as good as the translators will do for you. So I will say bonsoir to everyone here. Why don't we all start with a prayer to begin our evening of prayer? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Loving God, we thank you so much for bringing us together. Thanks to the Jesuits of Canada, and thanks to all the people who work with them, all their colleagues, lay colleagues, religious, for gathering us here. We ask that as we speak about prayer and we speak about the ways that you are at work in our lives, that you open our hearts and our minds to receive your Spirit. And we ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So as Patricia said, I'm going to speak to you today about prayer and about learning to pray, which is the title of my book. This is my one advertisement. So anything that I don't cover is covered in this book, Learning to Pray. Now you notice that the subtitle is pretty provocative. It's a guide for everyone, for tout le monde. And the question that a lot of people say is, well, it's not for me. Prayer is not for me. I don't know how to pray. I've tried to pray and it's boring. Nothing happens. And I think there are so many reasons why people feel that it is not for them. So I want to start with the statement that prayer is for everybody. Now, you might be, sitting in your living room or in your bedroom or maybe in your car and thinking that's ridiculous, thinking that, well, everyone else prays better than I do. I have tried to do it and it's been not satisfying. Or even when I try to do it and I'm regular about it, I don't feel like I'm making any progress. So it's not for me. Or you may be someone who tuned into this and think, well, I've never really tried to pray and maybe I can try it. Or maybe a long time ago, you used to pray and have given up. Or maybe you pray regularly and it's dry a lot of times. So you might say prayer is really not for me. You might say to yourself that I know I should pray. I'm told by so many priests and religious that prayer is an important part of the spiritual life, but I cannot. But I'm here to tell you that prayer is really for everyone. Now, how do we know that? Well, it's because God desires a relationship with everyone. Okay, God wants to enter into a relationship with everyone. And how do we know that? Well, you might think that you can't pray or that your prayer is not good or that your prayer is too dry. But, there's something that has prompted you, all 144 of you, to be on this webinar tonight. Something in you desires prayer. Where does that come from? Well, you might say, well, it's a curiosity or something that I think I should do, but there is something in you that is moving you to pray. There is a desire in you that you can't deny because you're on this call, after all, that you can't deny, that wants to pray, that desires a relationship with God, right? That desires to encounter God, that desires a more prayerful life. And here's the question, where does that come from? Again, it might be curiosity or just a feeling of should, but I would say that desire for prayer comes from God. Okay, if you think about that for a second. The desire for prayer, the desire for God comes from God. It is planted within you as a way God has of drawing you closer. It's a call, basically. Okay. Now, how else would God awaken a desire within you, right, to get closer? How else would God call you other than by doing that, by awakening a desire within you for God? So one of the most important things to recognize is that your desire for God is really at heart God's desire for you. A few years ago, and I apologize to the translators, I was going a little fast. A few years ago, I was in a retreat house where I saw a plaque that said, "That which you seek is seeking you. That which you seek is seeking you." And so to pay attention to this idea of God calling you. Now, oftentimes when people are just beginning in the spiritual life, that can be very consoling for them because they recognize that they are not simply responding to a kind of idle curiosity, right? But they are responding to a call. So that's the first thing I want to say. Everyone is called to pray. Everyone can pray, and everyone is called to pray by God. All right, so you may accept that and say, okay, Father Jim, that's fine. But what is prayer? Well, let's look at a couple definitions that I find very helpful as we enter into this question of prayer. The first definition is the definition that leads off the discussion of prayer in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And it is from St. John Damascene. St. John Damascene, who is a 4th century Syrian monk, whose definition of prayer is a raising of the mind and heart to God and a requesting of good things. Okay, so let's look at that. That's a good place to start. Prayer is a raising of the mind and the heart. So it is not just intellectual, it's feeling. It's about a love relationship. And it's a requesting of good things from God. I'm sure all of us, certainly in the midst of the pandemic, have all asked for good things from God, right? I pray for good things from God every day, right? It's a natural way to pray. But that definition, might be a little confusing for people because it might make us wonder what God is doing, right? What is God's response? Okay, so let's look at the next definition, which is from Saint Therese of Lisieux, right? The wonderful Carmelite sister, who I'm sure you know, whose feast day we just celebrated a few days ago. For her, prayer is a surge of the heart, or surge from the heart. Okay, now that's something almost we can't not do, right? It's something that is almost natural. It's natural for us, right? It's almost a kind of reflexive action. Okay, so prayer is a surge from the heart, and that really is that Therese's way of looking at prayer is really part of the love relationship that we have with God. She famously said that if the body of Christ, the church, is a body, right, that she wanted to be the heart. So it's all about love. Okay. So those two definitions, a raising of the mind and heart to God and an asking of good things, and Therese's definition of a surge from the heart, are both good places to start, but they raise a certain question. And the question is, what is God's response? So while we are raising our mind and heart to God, right, and asking for good things, and while our hearts are surging, what is God's response? It seems somewhat one-sided, doesn't it? The next definition gets a little bit more into the mutuality of prayer. The next definition is from St. Teresa of Avila, also a Carmelite, predecessor of St. Therese. And she said that prayer was a mutual conversation between friends. Okay, a conversation between friends. That gets into a little bit more of the back and forth nature of it, but it also raises a question. What does it mean to listen to God? What does it mean to be in a conversation with God? Does that mean that I hear voices or see visions somehow? Well, we'll come back to that. But again, that gets into a really good understanding of prayer as kind of mutual, right? A sharing between friends, which was, after all, what Ignatius's way of looking at prayer was like. A definition that I found very helpful in my own life is from a Jesuit priest named Father Walter Burkhardt, who was a U.S. Jesuit priest who was very involved in social justice work and also writing. Father Burkhardt's definition of prayer is a long, loving look at the real, a long, loving look at the real. It's long because it's hopefully not rushed, right? Like any good relationship, it wouldn't be rushed. It's important to be spending time with God. It's loving. It's done in the context of a loving relationship. It's a look. It's a kind of contemplative look. And it's looking at the real often. okay? That the reality of God's presence in your life. For those of you who are familiar with the examination of conscience, I'm sure you've all heard of that, the review of the day, where you look back over the day and see where God is, and we can talk about that later on if you'd like. That's a very good example, a very good illustration of Walter Burkhart's long, loving look at the real. So the next definition I like really changed the way I pray and really opened up prayer for me. And I'd like to thank Father William Barry, who was a Jesuit priest who just died about 6 or 7 months ago, I think last year, maybe in November or December of last year. He was a great spiritual director in New England. And his definition of prayer was that prayer is a personal relationship with God. Okay, now, what does that mean? Well, one of the great gifts of Father Barry's work and his definition is that kind of definition, a personal relationship with God, can really help us diagnose our prayer. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, all the things that you can say about a good relationship with a close friend or even a spouse, right? Or a partner or a lover, you can say about a relationship with God by analogy. Okay, obviously God is more than just our friend, but let's look at this for a second. So you might ask yourself, what kinds of things make up a good relationship? Okay, well, what kinds of things make for a good friendship, let's say? Well, the very first thing would be time. Okay, imagine if I said to you, who is your best friend or who is your person you're closest to in your life? And you might say, my sister or my mother or my boyfriend or my spouse or whatever, or my best friend or my neighbor. You know, people usually have someone that they're very close to. And you say, okay, how much time do you spend with that person? What if you said never? Or how much one-on-one time do you spend with that person? What if you said never? I never spend one-on-one time with that person. Or maybe 5 minutes every month. Well, you would say, I wonder what kind of relationship that is. But that is often what happens with God. We say that God is the most important person in our lives. But when you ask a person how much one-on-one time they spend with God in prayer, they say, not much. So time is really important, just to help people get to know one another. The more time you spend in prayer, the more you get to know what God sounds like, what God feels like. Okay, what else is important for a good relationship? Well, how about listening? Right? Imagine if we were good friends and we had a standing Friday night dinner appointment. We went out every Friday night, and maybe you do this with a spouse. Imagine if you never listened to the person, right? If all you did was talk, ask for things, right? What kind of a relationship would that be? That would be somewhat one-sided and also a little odd, right? I mean, admittedly, very odd. I never let my friend talk. I only talk myself. And yet again, this is often what happens in prayer, right? It's all about talking at God, which is fine, but we have to get into the situation where we're listening to God as well. All right. So listening is important. What else? How about change? Again, this is where the friendship model is so helpful. Imagine you say to me, here's my best friend, say Patricia. Patricia's my best friend. And I'm coming up with a name. It's not exactly Patricia, but I'm sure we could be good friends. And I've known her since we were 2 years old. And I say, well, what's your relationship like? Or someone says, what's your relationship like? And I say, it's exactly the same as it was when we were 2 years old. You would think that was kind of odd, wouldn't you? And yet again, that's often what people say about God. My relationship with God has never changed. It will never change. And so change has to be part of a relationship with God. That doesn't mean God changes. It means you change in your relationship with God. Also, silence is important sometimes, right? Imagine an old married couple who are so companionable and so comfortable with one another that they can take long drives in silence, or they can wash the dishes together in silence, or watch TV together in silence, or take a walk on a beach in silence. They don't have to say anything. And in fact, maybe saying something, if they're taking a long walk on the beach or looking at a sunset, would seem strange. So silence is okay for prayer. So Bill Barry's definition has been so helpful for me in my own life to help me understand what prayer is. All right. So a personal relationship with God. Now, summing all of those definitions up, prayer is a raising of the mind and heart to God and an asking of good things. Prayer is a surge from the heart. Prayer is a mutual sharing between friends. Prayer is long, loving look at the real. And prayer is a personal relationship with God. The definition that I've come up with based on all of those is that prayer is a conscious conversation with God. Something we do consciously, right? It's not something that just happens, although sometimes you can be led into prayer. And it is a conversation. It's a back and forth. All right. So that's kind of an introduction to prayer in terms of its definitions. Now I'd like to look at, I think, one of the most, if not most, misunderstood, frightening, and confusing parts about the spiritual life. And it's not how to pray, because I think most of us on this call, on this webinar, know more or less the techniques, right? And we could talk about this later on if you'd like, or if we have time. The techniques of prayer, the examination of conscience, Ignatian contemplation, where you imagine yourself in the scene, Lectio Divina, where you go through a scripture passage, centering prayer, nature prayer. These kinds of things are easy, I think, to read in a book or even to be taught. It takes a while to in a sense, get used to them, but they're very common, I would say, right? Again, we can talk about them later if we have time. But I think what's the most difficult thing for people is the results of prayer. What is supposed to happen? And I will tell you that when I entered the Jesuit novitiate in 1988 in Boston, I was baffled by this. People would say, oh, my prayer was so rich, or, oh, I felt Jesus inviting me to look at this, or, oh, I felt God telling me this. And truly, and I'm sure there are a lot of people, now we have 150 participants. I'm sure in that 150 participants among you are many people who say, I don't know what to expect, and I don't know what's supposed to happen. The question that how I phrased it in the book, in Learning to Pray, is what happens when I close my eyes? Literally, what happens? Am I supposed to see visions or hear things, or what is it? What's supposed to go on? And when I was in the novitiate, I found that very frustrating. But it's not. It shouldn't be frustrating, and it's not so mysterious. If you go to any spiritual director, whether in Guelph is a place I'm very familiar with, or Eastern Point in Gloucester, Massachusetts, or Campion Center in Weston, Mass, to pick a few favorite places, they will be very happy to talk to you about this. So what I'd like to do tonight, is to focus on this question of what happens when you pray. Okay, so let us take a passage, and let's take today's gospel passage, because it is so beautiful and so beloved. And it is the gospel of Martha and Mary. Okay, so I'm sure you all know it, but in case you don't, Jesus is in Bethany. Okay, Bethany is a small town right over the Mount of Olives. It's still there, by the way. It's called El Azaria, the place of Lazarus. This is where Lazarus died and was raised from the dead by Jesus. But Martha and Mary, two sisters, are in their house in Bethany. It's a place where Jesus would often relax as a rest from his public ministry. He was definitely close to Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus, although Lazarus is not in this story. And they're having dinner. And it turns out that Martha says to Jesus, Lord, don't you see, I'm paraphrasing, that Mary is not helping me in the kitchen, right? Martha was worried and upset that she was doing all this work, serving him by herself. And she says, tell her then to help me. And Jesus says in those famous words, Martha, Martha, you are busy about many things. Only one thing is necessary, and Mary has chosen the better part, and that will not be taken from her. Okay, so it's a very short gospel passage. Let's assume that you are praying with it in the form of Ignatian contemplation, and you imagine yourself in the scene, right? You picture yourself in the scene. You picture what the house in Bethany looks like. You imagine with as much detail as you can what Mary and Martha looks like. You might imagine the food. You imagine Jesus's appearance, how he's sitting, what the food smells like. Maybe where is the kitchen? Is it outside? Is it inside? What are you feeling? Is it cold? What are you hearing? Is it very quiet, or is the door open to a busy street outside? So in Ignatian contemplation, you imagine or compose the scene. Now, here's the big question. So you do that in your mind's eye, or you do what's called Lectio Divina. You go through and you look at the different parts of the reading, and you try to say, what is God saying to me in this? What do I want to say to God about this? You kind of don't imagine it as much as think about it. All right, what kinds of things can happen when you pray? First of all, an insight can come up. All right, so these are all the kinds of things that can come up in prayer, an insight. You might be praying with the story of Martha and Mary and have an insight that even that Martha is very busy, maybe like you, and maybe you have an insight of a time, or things that you do in your life where you might be a little too busy, right? Now, oftentimes people take this passage to elevate the contemplative life over the active life, and I don't think that's what Jesus is doing at all. I mean, Jesus himself was a very active person, and someone had to cook the dinner. But I think what Jesus is saying is that there's a time and place for everything. So maybe you have an insight into something in your own life, okay? You have an awareness or a recognition of perhaps being too scattered, right? Too busy, always doing things in an almost obsessive way. So part of the fruit of prayer is that this might be God raising up this within you. So in other words, I'm sorry about that. So in other words, to take seriously the possibility that this insight is not simply something that happened to occur to you, but it is in fact God raising it up in you. So there are also insights are a very important fruit of prayer. Pay attention to those things. The second thing that can come up is an emotion. All right, let's say that you are praying with this passage and suddenly you feel a sense of anger. You're angry, and it's okay to be angry in prayer at Jesus, because you say, well, it's so unfair for Martha. She's just working hard. Poor Martha. And there's Mary, and I would be upset too if my sister were just doing nothing and I was doing all the work. And maybe you feel in your family or at work, in your family, at work, that you are the one that does everything and you feel just so overwhelmed. And so you start to feel angry, and it's surprising because at the beginning of the prayer passage, you weren't angry at all. This is very common, right? Very common to have an emotion raised up in prayer. And I think what's going on is that God is, in a sense, raising it up in you, right? In order for you to look at it, right? It's a gift. It's a gift for you to look at this prayer. I'm sorry, let me just turn this off. Pardon me. It's an invitation for you to look at this with God. All right. So God is raising up this emotion in prayer. All sorts of emotions can come up in prayer. Okay. I mean, sadness, joy, right? All sorts of emotions can come up. Frustration, anything that is a human emotion can come up in prayer. And just pay attention to these things when they come up. All right. So emotions can come up. What else can come up? A feeling can come up. All right. So it's not an insight. It's not an intellectual insight. It's not an emotion. You don't feel angry or sad or happy or joyful, but you have this feeling. For example, let's say you're praying with this passage of Mary and Martha in Bethany, and you have this great feeling of calm. Maybe you just imagine yourself as Mary sitting at Jesus's feet, and you just want to spend time there in your prayer, just imagining yourself at Jesus's feet, listening to him. You know, the time that we've all spent in COVID, the time that we've spent sort of frustrated and worried about getting sick and maybe even losing relatives and loved ones. You just want to spend time quietly with Jesus, and you get this great feeling of calm. So pay attention to that. You know, I think one of the most common gifts in the pandemic in people's prayer has been calm, right? In other words, God gives us the gift of calm. So pay attention to these feelings of calm, peace, uplift, right? St. Ignatius Loyola says that only God can give this sense of uplift and encouragement. So again, it's not exactly an emotion, but you might also just get a sense, even that it feels like it has nothing to do with the reading. You might be praying, you're in the presence of God when you're praying, and you might get this sense of uplift or encouragement. Pay attention to that as well. So insights, emotions, feelings. What else can come up? Well, a desire can come up. Desires are very important in prayer. I'll tell you a story. Recently, I was directing a young woman, actually it was more like 5 years ago, and she was praying over the passage of the call of the first disciples, right? So Jesus is at the Sea of Galilee, and he calls Peter and Andrew and James and John, right? You all know that story. And in her meditation, the woman imagined herself far away from the crowd, far away from Jesus and the first disciples, right? That's just the way she ended up picturing it. And she felt a great desire to be with the group. She wanted to be with Jesus. So that's one way that a desire can come up in prayer. Or you are praying about the passage with Martha and Mary tonight, and you feel a desire to be more like Mary. You feel this desire to live a more contemplative and quiet and less busy and less scattered life, like Mary does in the story. You might be praying or reading a book about the life of a saint, and you decide to pray about this, and you feel this great desire to be like, for example, Therese of Lisieux, right? You might, for example, hear my comment about Therese and think about the life of Saint Therese, the little flower, and feel this desire to be like her. You might feel a desire in your prayer simply for a more prayerful or spiritual life. So all these, you might feel a desire to reconcile with someone. Okay, so all these kinds of desires can come up. I think probably the most common desire is a deeper relationship with God, or a desire to follow Jesus more closely, right? Sometimes it's hard even to put your finger on these things. These things can overlap, right? You can be joyful and feel a desire to follow Jesus. You can feel angry at something and feel a desire to speak to Jesus about these things. So again, emotions, insights, desires, feelings. What else? Memories. Memories are an extraordinarily powerful thing and a real gift in prayer, I think. You might be praying with the story of Martha and Mary, and suddenly, out of nowhere, seems to have very little to do with the reading, you have a memory of a wonderful dinner that you had when you were a little girl or a little boy, right? Or you're back in your parents' dining room or kitchen, or someplace that you used to go outside during the summertime. Where does this memory come from? You've asked yourself. It's very powerful, seems to have come out of nowhere. It seems to have been prompted by the reflection of Jesus eating, right? Jesus dining with Mary and Martha. And you just enjoy it and you start to remember these things. It's very calming. It's very consoling, right? This may be God raising up in your mind, in your consciousness, in your heart, this memory, simply to console you. Sometimes memories come up to heal you. You know, a painful memory might come up in order for Jesus to heal that memory. One thing that I often suggest to people is to go back to a difficult time and imagine Jesus with you there. It can be very healing for people to go back in prayer to that time and imagine Jesus with you. Maybe express your sadness or anger or frustration with Jesus and what had happened to you, but also let him be there with you in your prayer. One of the most moving prayer experiences I've had in the past couple of years was one around memory, and I'll share it with you. I was on a retreat, and my mother, who was just calling me, was selling our family house. My father died in 2001, and my mother lived there for another 6 or 7 years. This is outside Philadelphia, and she was about to sell it. And I was on retreat at a Trappist monastery, and I was working on a book on Jesus called Jesus, a Pilgrimage. And I was very taken or captivated by the idea, or with the idea, of Jesus having his own house. Now, in other words, in Capernaum, which was Jesus's home base of ministry in Galilee, he had a place where he stayed. Sometimes people think it was in Peter's house. Most likely he had his own house. That captivated me for some reason, and I enjoyed thinking about it. What would Jesus's house have been like? So on this retreat, I said to my spiritual director, I'm not sure what to pray about. I'm not sure whether I should pray about Jesus's house, since that's something I've been thinking about, or if I should pray about my mom selling our family house, because that's very emotional for me. He said, why don't you invite Jesus into your family house and go through each of the rooms one by one and talk to Jesus about what happened there? Let me tell you, it was really powerful. I'm sorry. It was really powerful. It was powerful to go through all those rooms in the house, my bedroom, all the things that had happened there, being a little boy and doing my homework there, looking out the window at the snow and at the birds, right? And at the leaves, the living room, the dining room. I won't go into all the different memories. So it was very powerful with a lot of tears, really going back in memory to this very graced past, not all perfect, of course. And then at the end of the meditation, I'll share this with you. I was crying. This is only a few years ago, 10, 13, 7 or 8 years ago. And I remember thinking, well, I guess I'm going to have to close the door now, right? Because the memory's over. But when we left the house, in my imagination, the door was open, meaning that I could go back there anytime I wanted to in my memory. So memories can be a very powerful thing that happen in prayer. Okay. So insights, emotions, desires, feelings, memories, words and phrases can come up. A Jesuit priest in my community told this wonderful story about being in Paris studying. He was finishing his PhD. And at the end of his studies, he did not know what he wanted to do. So, of course, as you know, Jesuits are missioned by their provincial, by their regional superior to their different ministries. But you are also asked, what would you like to do? Because the Jesuits trust that God is at work in you and in your desires again. And so my friend didn't know what he wanted to do. So he decided that he would take a trip to Chartres, to the cathedral in Chartres, about an hour or so outside of Paris, I believe. and he would present himself to God in the cathedral and sit down and ask God what he should do, right? What do you want me to do? Now, we can't know that every time we sit down and ask God for an answer, we're going to get an answer right away, but this is what my friend did. So he takes the train all the way out to Chartres, and he goes into the cathedral, planning to spend, as he tells it, the whole morning there. And he sits down, and he expected God would say something like, I want you to teach at, Regis in Toronto, or I want you to teach at Boston College, or I want you to teach at Georgetown. Instead, he sat down and he said, within the first 5 or 10 minutes, welling up from inside of him came the words, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Now, again, he didn't hear them. He didn't have a vision, but these are the words that came into his mind very clearly, feed my sheep. So occasionally words and phrases can come up in our minds. My mother said once that she was praying and she asked God, do you love me, God? And the words that came into her mind were more than you know, right? They just popped into her mind. Now, we have to be careful. Not every word or phrase that pops into our mind is from God, right? As a friend of mine likes to say, not every leaf that falls in front of you on the pavement is a sign from God. But sometimes these things that come into our minds are communications from God. So all these things can happen in prayer, whatever kind of prayer you're doing. So emotions, insights, memories, desires, feelings, words, and phrases. We can also sometimes have mystical experiences, right? They're not all the time, but they do happen. Time when you feel overwhelmed with God's love. One young man, I talk about this in the book, described it as feeling almost as if he were a vase or a vase, depending on where we are, overflowing with God's love. So sometimes these experiences that in a sense almost feel like they take us out of ourselves can happen. So all those things can happen. Now, those are all the fruits of prayer that I wanted to focus and spend some time on a little bit at length, because I tend to think that people just don't know what to expect. Now, very important, this is not always going to happen, right? So oftentimes it feels like nothing is happening. And I think that's a very important thing to look at very briefly. Dryness in prayer is very common. This morning, I had a really nice prayer period meditating on this gospel passage. The day before, it didn't feel like anything was happening. Now, I think that in prayer, there is always something going on, okay? Because being in the presence of the divine is always something that is going to transform us, but it doesn't always feel like that. So to go back to Bill Barry's model of prayer as a relationship, remember that not every relationship or interaction with your friend or your spouse or even your best friend or your brother or your sister is going to be wonderful or emotional. Sometimes it feels very flat. Sometimes it feels almost that nothing has happened, right? Or that you've gone backwards. So be okay with dryness in your prayer life. But I wanted to spend time on these fruits of prayer to help you know what to expect. Now, before we open it up to questions, I want to spend a little bit of time on two brief topics. One, how do we know that these things are from God that come up into our prayer, right? And two, what do we do about distractions? And then I'll take your questions. Now, I have to get my book for the first one because I have a whole list of things for how do we know that it is God. So, for example, let's say that you are my friend who has gone out to Chartres and has heard these words, feed my sheep. How do you know that that's God? Because what if some other words came into your mind? All right, so here we go. Let's see if I can find this. So how do I know that it is God? Okay. Well, there's a couple simple ways of looking at this. First of all, is the evil spirit involved? Now, St. Ignatius Loyola talked about the good spirit and the evil spirit. right? The spirit that moves us towards God, that's coming from God, and the spirit that moves us away from God. Now, for example, if I'm praying and I am praying about someone that I'm angry about, right? And I have a desire to punch that person in the face, right? We have to say that is probably not coming from God, right? That is probably something from the evil spirit. I say, oh, I can't stand that person. And you get more and more and more agitated and more and angry. That is probably not coming from God. So is the evil spirit involved? Most times people can discern that. Second, does it make sense? All right. So with my friend, Mark, I'm sorry, I should have said his name. With my friend, it makes sense. He's a priest. To have the words feed my sheep come into my mind makes sense. Makes sense, right? If the words, I'm going to just make something up. If some crazy words came into your mind or something from some TV show you saw last night or made no sense to your life or what you were praying about, you'd say that's probably a distraction. Okay. If the image of a hamburger came into Mark's mind, right? Is that an answer to his prayer? No, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's probably a distraction. So does it make sense? Does it lead to an increase in love and charity? Remember when I talked about just now praying about someone you were angry with and you think about punching that person in the face, that doesn't really lead to an increase in love and charity. If by chance you're praying and you have this desire for reconciliation, yeah, that does lead to an increase in love and charity. Does it fit with what I know about God? Does it make sense that God would ask a priest to feed my sheep? Yes. Does it make sense that God would ask you to reconcile with this person that you're angry at? Yes. Does it make sense that God, in the middle of a pandemic, would give you a feeling of calm? Yes. Does it make sense that God would want you to have a healing experience when you are moving out of your family's house? Yes. So does it make sense with what I know about God? The fifth way to look at this is it a distraction, right? So again, we talked about my friend having an image of a hamburger. Maybe he's hungry. That's a distraction. We'll get to distractions in a little bit. Is it wish fulfillment? Sometimes we say, all right, God, I want an answer to this question. Should I move or should I not? The answer, yes, comes into our mind. Now, part of the thing is that sometimes this can be just wish fulfillment. We want God to say this. This is a very difficult thing to discern, right? But my feeling is that over time, right, it's better to sort of spend time with these things, with those kinds of questions. And finally, is it important? In my experience, God usually enters into our prayer with something that is an important thing. Okay, so it was important for my friend to hear, feed my sheep. It is important for someone to be calmed down in the middle of the pandemic. All right, so those are some ways of discerning whether or not it's coming from God or from you. Now, of course, everything is mediated, right? Everything is going to be coming through your consciousness. But I think that we all know what I'm talking about when I'm saying, is it coming from God or is it coming from you? Okay. And finally, before we go to the questions, I want to talk about distractions in prayer. Everyone gets distracted. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, said, if you've never been distracted, you've never prayed, which is great. We all have bodies, and so we might have a cold sore or a backache or sciatica or a headache or allergies, right? All sorts of things. You might have noises from outside. You might have things that are on your mind. Of course, you have things on your mind. Everyone does, right? Now, there's not one person in this 152 group of people that does not have something on their mind right now. A medical procedure coming up, financial problems in your family. Everyone can have distractions. What do you do with them? Well, first of all, it's to determine whether or not these are important distractions or unimportant distractions. An important distraction might be something that God is actually raising up for you to look at. A couple of years ago, a young Jesuit came to me and said he kept trying to pray, but he was disturbed by the image of someone in his community with whom he had had an argument. And I said, maybe it's not a distraction. So maybe God is raising something up. But usually a distraction is something that is unimportant at the moment, right? So noise from outside, you're hungry, you can hear the faucet drip, right? Someone beeping a car or a truck is backing up. Usually it is something that is unimportant. Now, what do you do in those situations? Well, you try to let it go as much as possible. One thing to remember is not to get angry at yourself for being distracted. You're human. The spiritual writer Margaret Silf wrote in a wonderful, with a wonderful image, that prayer is something like driving down the street, right? You're focused on the road or the destination ahead of you. There are all sorts of things going on either side of you that you notice and that you perceive and that you are aware of, but you don't pay attention to it, right? So you know that there are people walking on the street or cars going past or stores that you see, right? Or even something pretty, right? On the horizon, but you're focused on the road. That's a great definition, a great way of looking at distractions. You perceive them, you're aware of them, but you're focused on the road. Okay. But what happens when you can't let go of these things? When you can't let them go, like as a friend of mine says, bubbles, birds, and balloons. Bubbles, they float up and they pop. Birds, they fly across your field of vision and they're gone. Or balloons, they come into your field of vision, they float up. What happens when you can't get rid of those unimportant distractions? Well, then I often recommend one of my favorite prayers, which is, God, I am distracted and I'm with you. Okay. Think about Bill Barry's analogy of prayer as a personal relationship or a friendship. If you are out with a good friend at dinner one night, and you say to your friend, I'm sorry, I'm very distracted right now, I apologize, what would your good friend say? Your good friend would say either, let's talk about it, or that's okay. I know you're distracted. I'm just happy you're with me. I'm just happy that we're here. And if your friend can say that to you, how much more can God say that to you? And how much more can God be with you in your distraction? So one of my favorite prayers, God, I am distracted and I'm with you. So that concludes my little talk tonight. Just as a review, what have we talked about? Well, we talked about how everyone can pray. Everyone is called to pray because the desire for prayer comes from God, and that's a call from God. We've talked about the definitions of prayer: a raising of the mind and heart to God, a surge from the heart, a mutual sharing between friends, a long, loving look at the real, a personal relationship, and then a conscious conversation with God. We've looked at the kinds of things that can happen in the different types of prayer. And again, all these types of prayer, Ignatian contemplation, the examen, Lectio Divina, nature prayer, centering prayer, rote prayer, we haven't even talked about that, are all in this book, Learning to Pray. But we've talked about specifically the fruits of prayer: insights, emotions, desires, memories, feelings, words and phrases, mystical experiences. We've talked about the ways that you can start to discern whether or not this is coming from me or really coming from God. And then finally, we've talked about how to deal with distractions. So, my friends, that is a sort of overview of prayer. It's an introduction to my book. There's much more in the book, especially about the techniques. And I hope you all got a chance to read it. But for now, I'm really happy to answer your questions. And thank you very much. And especially thank you to, again, the translators, to whom I'm very, very grateful. Merci bien.
Thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about. And we already have lots of questions pouring in. I'm in daily contact with the victims of the Colombian conflict, listening to their truth voices. I felt how the victims lived from the prayer, from their relationship with God. My question is, What's the place of suffering in the unfair situations when God has a calling to pray? What's the way to open our eyes to contemplate God's work in the suffering of people? Thank you for the spiritual guide.
Well, that's a very big question. And so it is, let me just make sure I understand that, Patricia. It is, what is the place in that person's prayer as they contemplate the suffering of other people? Is that the sense?
What's the place of suffering and the unfair situation when God has a calling to pray?
I see. Well, I think there's the first thing I think is you can use Walter Burkhart's example of the long, loving look at the real to remember that, God is in this situation in some way. And I would say a few things. First of all, to be honest with God about the difficulty of seeing these things. Now, you can be honest with God in prayer. You can make it more specifically Jesus. You can imagine yourself with Jesus in these situations. Jesus, who was a victim of unfair, in a sense, suffering, right? He was sinless, certainly understands that kind of pain. Jesus also looked upon people who were suffering. Okay, so Jesus is someone who understands suffering from his own life, but also from seeing it in other people's lives. Jesus's heart was also, as the Gospels say, moved with pity. And so another way of looking at this, in addition to speaking with Jesus about this and expressing yourself, is seeing within you the feelings that arise in you as ways that God has of moving you. So in other words, if you feel this sense of anger or a sense of anger at the injustice or sorrow simply at the suffering, to see in that perhaps God working through you, God kind of raising up this emotion in you to sort of comfort these people. So I think there's lots of different ways of approaching suffering in our own lives and suffering in the lives of other people as well. But I think one of the key things is being honest in prayer with God about what you are feeling. And again, remember that relationship model. If you say, for example, the things that you think that you should say, only the things you should say. So a lot of people would say, well, whatever, suffering is part of the world and I must accept it. And you feel this sense of anger about that, and you don't express your true feelings to God, your relationship with God may get somewhat cold and distant, right? So key is expressing your honest and your true feelings to God about what you are encountering.
You mentioned in early days as a Jesuit, many expressed strong messages from God. Jesus spoke to me today. You mentioned that you really questioned that you had no experience of that. All these years later, with all of your studies, has that changed in your life? Can we do something to increase such experiences?
Yes. Jesus and God, well, I would say they're the same, of course, but God was speaking to me frequently. I just wasn't encouraged to notice it. One of my favorite lines is from a Jesuit priest. Maybe some of you knew him. He worked on the Indian reservations in South Dakota. I mean, I know that's far, but he was also in Canada for a while. Bob Gilroy. And Bob Gilroy said that people have experiences of God all the time, but they're not encouraged to talk about them, which I love. What I meant by that earlier comment, though, was that when I would hear people say in the novitiate, I would hear other novices say, God said this to me, God was doing this to me. It wasn't that how do I say it? It was that I wasn't sure what they meant about those experiences in prayer. What I thought they meant was that they were hearing voices or that they were seeing visions. And when it was pointed out to me that no, what they're talking about is just the kinds of things we were talking about tonight: emotions, insights, memories, desires. That's what they meant by God communicating with me. And I'm glad we brought that around, because that's what I mean about listening to God in our prayer. So we listen to God during our daily life. We can look around, and I think most of us on this webinar it's easier for us to say, yes, I see God in my friends, or I saw God in nature today, or when I got this piece of good news, I felt God with me, or my pet, right? I'm thinking a lot about pets. I look at videos online about dogs and stuff. My pet made me feel loved by God. I think that's a fairly, shall we say, easy for some people to do, to listen that way. But it is difficult sometimes for people to listen to in prayer. That's what I meant by that. So in other words, to be more specific, what I meant was that I was worried in a sense that I would never have these experiences because I was misunderstanding what they were talking about. So it's to just pay attention. How do we increase our ability to have these experiences? Well, they're always gifts. First of all, they're always gifts. But we have to sort of be much more aware and attentive and notice them more. So notice them. I have so many people that come to me that say, I can't pray, or I've never had an experience with God. And you just dig a little deeper, and they have. It's just that they're not encouraged to talk about it. And they're not encouraged to say, have you ever thought that that's God? A great question, by the way.
Father, when will your book be translated into French?
I hope very soon. I think it is coming out in Spanish soon, but let me tell you, if you know any French language publishers in Canada, let me know and I will put them in touch with the publisher. The way it works is, I didn't realize this until I started writing books. A publisher has to have an interest in it, and then they contact the English language publisher. That's how it works. So I don't sort of try to sell it. I just hope that publishers take an interest. So if there are any Catholic publishers out there that you know of, tell them you want the book in French, and that would make me très heureux.
How do you handle unanswered prayer?
There's a whole chapter in the book on that. And it is a great question, because we have to admit that some prayers are not answered the way we would want. Now, there are so many, I would say, unhelpful explanations. People say, oh, well, God is giving you something better. Now, look, if you're praying for a child who is sick and the child doesn't get better, or you're praying for a relative who dies, that's a really harsh thing to hear about God. God has taken your child to give you something better. That's a kind of very strange way of approaching things. Or God answers, but the answer is no. Because God, or God's testing you. Right? That's another one. God is testing you. And so a lot of these answers really fail in the face of legitimate suffering. Again, the suffering of a child, right? Or a natural disaster, right? And sometimes these things make God out to be almost like a monster or a sadist. Or God has answered your prayers, but you can't see how. Well, and you have to be a detective. No, I think that the most honest response to why God doesn't seem to answer our prayers as we would like is that we don't know. Okay. So for example, my dad died of lung cancer at age 67 in 2001. Right. So did I pray to God for him to be healed? Yes. Was he healed? No. So my prayer was not answered in the way that I would like. Now, did God give me something better? I mean, I got many, there were many graces and insights that I got from his death, but I wouldn't say that it's better. So that makes God out to be kind of a monster. So what is the answer to that question? The answer is we don't know. And the invitation is to continue to be in a relationship with a God whom we don't understand. So I am still in relationship with God, even with those kinds of things and other difficulties in my life that I don't understand. That's okay. So I think that's the most helpful response. Let me share something with you that has helped me and that is in my book that was written by Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner, the great Jesuit theologian. And he talked about Jesus as the perfect model of prayer. And maybe this will help you. What was the person who asked that question, Patricia? I should have asked the names.
Let me.
Maybe they're not.
Hugh Egerton.
Hugh.
Oh.
So Hugh.
Oh, no.
That's okay. Well,
it's
we don't.
Dismissed already.
That's okay. That's all right. Now they go up so fast. So one of the most helpful things I've heard about prayer is that Jesus is the perfect model of the prayer, the one who prays. And what does that mean? It means Jesus's prayer was characterized by three things. This helped me so much: honesty, trust, and acceptance. So honesty. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus says to the Father, "Remove this cup from me." He's being honest. Jesus does not say, "Oh, I shouldn't say that." Right? Jesus is being honest. By the way, another insight about that story with Martha and Mary is Martha says to Jesus to tell her to help me. Who talks to Jesus like that? Martha and Jesus and Mary and Jesus must have been so close and so intimate that Martha felt that she could be honest with her friend. That is quite a thing to say to Jesus. I don't think anyone else in the New Testament says to Jesus, tell her to do this. So Jesus is honest with the Father. Remove this cup from me. So honesty. Second is trust. At the tomb of Lazarus, Karl Rahner points out that Jesus says, "God, I know that you hear me." So Jesus trusts that the Father hears him. And then finally, total acceptance. "Not your will, but my will be done," he says back in the Garden of Gethsemane. So I find that really helpful. Honesty, you're honest about what you want. You trust that God is hearing you, truly. That's a really important part. And acceptance. Now, what happens is we usually do 2 out of 3. We're honest. I want this. I know that you're hearing me. And then when we get the result, we don't like it. We don't accept it. Or oftentimes people who are very pious they're not honest. They say whatever you want, which is fine, but it short circuits things. Jesus does not go right into your will be done. He goes first to honesty. Or we miss the trust part. We just pray, and we don't believe God hears us, and we just keep praying and keep praying. So honesty, trust, and acceptance, I think, are really helpful in the relationship with God. And when we think about unanswered prayers, that's where the acceptance comes in, and the trust still, and the honesty. Great question.
How do you ask saints to pray for you?
What a great question. In the Catholic Church and in the Catholic tradition, we ask the saints to pray for us the same way that we'd ask someone on earth to pray for us. Now, a little different because you can see the person, and I can ask Patricia, "Would you pray for me?" And she says yes. In terms of the saints, like Therese of Lisieux, I pray to her and ask for her prayers. Okay. And I sometimes ask, "Please ask God for this." It's very important to remember, and I think many people misunderstand this about our tradition. We're not asking the saint to do the miracle or to effect this change. We're asking for their prayers, right? That's what it means with intercession. They are praying for us. They're interceding for us. And I do it all the time. Especially with Therese, St. Ignatius, St. Bernadette, Our Lady of Lourdes. These are my go-to people. But it's very important to say that they do not replace Jesus, right? Or God the Father. And not even Mary does. We're asking for their prayers the same way that we ask for someone's prayers on earth, but we trust that they are praying for us from their posts in heaven.
What are the steps in discernment?
Wow, that's a big question. So what are the steps in discernment? Discernment is a prayerful way of making decisions. In the Jesuit or Ignatian tradition, it's come to mean sort of weighing the spirits, okay? Weighing the spirits. Now, Ignatius talks about 3 times, calls them times, when you're making a decision, okay? The first, and usually it's, should I do this? Should I not do this? Should I move ahead? The first time is when Ignatius says, you don't doubt and you cannot doubt. Okay, so just absolutely. You've been waiting for an apartment to show up in this beautiful neighborhood in Toronto. It's exactly where you want it. It's the right price. It's actually cheaper than you thought it was going to be. It's quiet. It's beautiful. It's right near the public transportation, and it's very sunny, and it's ready now. Okay. Now that's not even, you could say that's not a decision, but it is a decision, right? But still, you don't doubt, nor can you doubt. Okay. It's just so clear to you. That's the first time. Usually people are not in that time. The second time is when you weigh the options and you feel moved by one spirit or another. Okay. So let's say, sometimes it's something like even a kind of existential question. Should I have hope in the middle of a pandemic? Right. And you realize that there's some parts of you that are kind of really pulling you down, right? Pulling you down and weighing you down, causing gnawing anxiety, as Ignatius says. When you think about things being hopeless, you just have this kind of lost feeling. When you say, I'm going to live a life full of hope, you get a feeling of uplift and joy and peace, right? And possibility. This is the second time when you're discerning the spirits, what is bringing you down and what is giving you encouragement, okay? You can use those. There's a couple other ways of using that, for example, if you're changing a job or making a decision. So to say, which way does my heart incline? Which way do I feel at peace? Which way gives me more uplift? Okay. So usually those decisions are fairly easy too, because it's clear which way the spirits are leading. Now, it's usually the third time when it's not clear. I don't feel the spirits within me, and I'm sort of dry. Now, in these cases, Ignatius gives us a couple tools. He says there's sort of imaginative tools. The first tool is to write down the pros and cons of both choices. So talking about making a decision, yes or no. Now we say, oh, big deal. Is that what Ignatius says? That doesn't sound so exciting. But oftentimes we don't do that. We don't write down the pros and the cons for both sides. And then Ignatius says, bring that before God. Even more helpful are other techniques. One is imagine someone in your situation coming to you. What would you say? Imagine you are on your deathbed. What would you have liked to have done? Now, obviously, picking an apartment in Toronto, it's not going to, maybe it will, but this is sort of like big life decisions about taking a new job or getting married. What would you like to do looking back on your deathbed? Imagine what you would like to say to Jesus at the last judgment. Now, again, I don't think Jesus is going to judge us for picking the wrong apartment in Toronto, but for a moral decision, this might be the case. If you are tempted to cheat on your spouse, right? Now, these things should be obvious, but, what do you want to say to Jesus on, at the last judgment, right? What do you want to say to Jesus? Okay. One way that I like to look at these decisions is also, what would your best self do? All of us have an image of what kind of person we would like to be. More loving, more free, more generous, more spontaneous, or maybe more hardworking, more loyal. What would your best self do? I'll tell you an example. A couple of years ago, the mother of a friend of mine died in upstate New York, and a very close friend of mine. And the funeral was inconvenient for me, right? It was in the middle of the week. I was very busy. And I thought, should I go? Should I not go? This is classic Ignatian discernment. Nothing seemed clear. I didn't feel any sort of spirits moving within me. I felt sort of torn. I felt like, well, maybe it's a good thing to go because, it's helping my friend, of course, and being with him, a corporal work of mercy. But maybe I was too tied to the idea that I had to do things to sort of win his friendship or to prove myself. So I really just sort of confused. So it was a decision in the third time. And I used that technique. What would your best self do? And like that, they'd say that your best self would get on a plane and go. The person you would want to be, the person you imagine yourself to be in 10 years would go. And I went. And I was happy I did it. So that's a little bit of discernment. I mean, discernment can mean two things. It can mean kind of weighing the spirits, not in the sense of decision, but just sort of understanding which way God is leading you. And it can be like a decision-making tool. So it's a kind of catch-all term that a lot of people use. These are great questions, hard ones too.
I think we only have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
The first one, thanks so much, Father. How can we strive through praying when we think things are unfair and our life did not go in the way we always expected and as we thought God wanted things to go?
Well, yeah, I think part of it is expressing in your prayer as much disappointment and sadness as you can. I remember something happened to me about 2 years ago. It went okay in the end, but the words that came to my mind were, "I'm so disappointed in you, God." And it was a hard thing to say, but I really needed to say that. So the first thing is to really be honest with God, okay, about these disappointments. And in a sense, let them, to grieve them because they're losses. Maybe your career didn't turn out the way you wanted it to be. Maybe you're lonelier than you thought you would be, or poorer than you thought you would be. And so part of it is expressing that to God and not feeling that is inappropriate, because again, God wants to know that. But the second thing is being aware of the ways that God is with you, even in this life that you didn't expect. So can you listen for signs of God and see signs of God in your daily life and in your prayer? Because wherever you are and in whatever state you're in, God wants to encounter you. So I think that's essential too. So it's being honest, but it's also being honest about the reality of God's presence in your life. It's looking at the whole picture. Let me tell you something. Maybe this will help, because that person sounds like they're maybe in a painful situation. I was speaking to my spiritual director a couple of years ago, and I was angry about something. And I said, "I'm so angry about this." And it was kind of a big thing. I had to have some surgery. It turned out okay, but it was kind of major surgery. And he said, "Are you being honest with God?" And I said, "Yes, I'm telling him how angry I am and all these terrible things that are happening. And I'm not diminishing what's happened in this questioner's life. I'm just trying to say this was my experience." And he said, "But are you talking about the good things as well?" I said, "Well, no." And he said, "Well, then you're not being honest with God. You're only focusing on one part of your life. So can you look at the totality of your life and bring that to God? The totality of your life and bring that to God." So that might help a little bit, but I think honesty is the most important thing.
In the book of the spiritual exercises, Ignatius gives additions to better find what I desire, among other things, for the first week. What is the spirit of these addendums?
Oh, that's a great question. Very specific Jesuit spirituality question. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the spiritual exercises is a guidebook for a 4-week retreat based on the life of Christ. And it is most often done. It's funny. I studied at Guelph for some of this, and with John English's book, which I would highly recommend. And Phil Shano was my director. Yeah. So also I'd encourage people to go to Guelph for a nice retreat. Each week, now I would say many people do the spiritual exercises at a retreat house for 4 weeks, but there is also a way of doing it called the 19th annotation, which means you do it in daily life. So you do it spread out. Maybe it takes 6 months or 8 months, sometimes even a year. But it's still divided into 4 weeks. The first week is a meditation on God's blessings in your life and eventually your own sinfulness, because we're all human beings. At the end of the first week, you have this, almost everyone feels this way. They feel like they are a loved sinner, right? They know their sinfulness, but they know that God loves them by meditating on these blessings. And that moves you to respond. And the response is, I want to follow God. I want to follow Jesus. And so the second week is a week of following Jesus imaginatively through his public ministry, everything, he's baptized, he does his miracles. Third week is a meditation on the passion and the death of Jesus, right? Going through the crucifixion imaginatively. Along the way, there are different meditations on humility and decisions and things like that, but it's essentially moving through the life of Christ. And then in the fourth week, we look at the resurrection and God's love in our life. Okay, so to get to your question, each week, we are asked by Ignatius to pray for what we desire. So each week has a different grace, different gift. The first week grace is to know oneself as a loved sinner. Right? We ask for that grace. I want to have this experience of both being loved and also understanding my sinfulness. The second week, it is to be with Jesus. It's to come to know Jesus intimately through his public ministry. The third week is sorrow for Jesus's crucifixion and even sorrow for our sins and the way we participate in that. Sometimes even confusion. We're asked to pray for confusion. It's a very strange thing to pray for, about our own sinfulness. Why am I so sinful? Why do I do these things? And then the grace of the fourth week is to rejoice exceedingly, to really participate in the grace and the joy of the resurrection. Why does Ignatius do this? Because these things are all gifts. So which is a very beautiful thing, he asks us and invites us to ask for these graces, not to just expect them. We don't just enter into the spiritual exercises and sit ourselves down and say, I'm going to do them and I'm going to produce. No, it's a gift. And so we ask for these graces. So those are the graces of as I understand them, those are the graces of the 4 weeks in the exercises.
Thank you. And our final question, one more. Is it normal to neglect family and focus on prayers?
Oh boy. I would say, I would say that we're all called to love our families, right? All of our families aren't perfect. And that question can be taken 2 ways. I think that on the one hand, we do need to take time to pray. So maybe that person who is asking has a very busy family life. I think it's reasonable to take out time to pray, to carve out time. Remember that image of the relationship, right? That you do want to spend time with God in prayer. Now, if you are the mother or father of young children, right? I've never had young children, but I have nephews. You might not have a whole lot of time for one-on-one prayer, but to make some time. Okay. So if there's never time for God, then, your prayer life might suffer. But by the same token, I don't think that means you neglect your family, right? I think God always calls us into, good relationships with our family. And I think the best prayer can actually help us see our family the way that God sees our family, compassionately.
Thank you. Father Martin, thank you for your interesting, challenging, and engaging presentation. You've opened up for us numerous possibilities for prayer in our own personal spiritual journeys. We look forward to having you back with us soon. Thanks also to Jose, Fanny, and our translators, Albert and Michelle, who have ensured the presentation went smoothly in French. And thanks to our audience for being with us for this evening. Upcoming, we have Brother Guy Consalmango, the director of the Vatican Observatory. He'll be with us on October 14th for a talk on Peru to Mars, New Worlds and Jesuit Science. And then Father Martin will be back with us on November the 2nd for Building a Bridge, the Catholic Church and the LGBT community. So we look forward to seeing all of you back with us again. Thank you very much and good night.
And a couple of
Jose?
Yeah, just 2 quick reminders. A recording of the session for those interested will be sent to you between 24 and 48 hours after the event, after today. And then please remember to fill out a brief poll that will pop on your screen at the end of the session. Thank you very much. Thank you, Father Martin.
Thank you. And let me say thank you again to Patricia and Jose and Michelle and Albert and Fanny, everyone for inviting me. I want to say, merci to all the people qui parlent français for listening to this. I hope I didn't speak too fast. I'm very happy to be here, and please keep me in your prayers. And good night and bonsoir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Good evening, everybody.
Okay, God bless.